My name's Martin Bailey. I'm a senior fellow here at Brookings. Welcome, everybody. I've been sort of praying to the weather gods all week, thinking that we were going to get snow and none of the participants were going to make it from Boston or San Francisco, but everybody's here. Unfortunately, they did provide a little rain to dampen the proceedings, but we got a great crowd here, so that obviously has not done too much damage. This is a joint event with the Kellogg School at Northwestern University, a joint project that Ben Harris and I have been running. And I want to acknowledge the financial support we've gotten from the Sloan Foundation and the Arnold Foundation. Could I ask everybody to turn their phones off or turn them to silent? That would help us all. We got a sort of fairly tight program, which means I need to get off the stage quickly, but we haven't programmed in any sort of coffee breaks. So as the people on the stage, if you need to sort of use the facilities, which are out the back there, or grab another quick cup of coffee, please do that sort of quickly and quietly and return. We haven't put any particular breaks in here. This program will run till about 12:30. The papers are available or will be available on the website. There are some that are out there, hard copies. Certainly they'll be on the website. So there are actually three. The two main ones are the papers being presented, and then Ben and I wrote a kind of framing paper to talk a little bit about the issues. There may be some mild revisions to those, so it's possible that the final versions will take a few days to go up, but they should be available on the website. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Jim Perturba. Jim is the Matsui Professor at MIT and the President of the National Bureau of Economic Research, one of our most distinguished economists. He's an expert on taxation, fiscal policy, and certainly on retirement. I've dabbled in stuff around retirement in the past, but it was about a year and a half ago I decided I wanted to start a new project on the retirement area, and I cannot tell you how many people said to me, well, you've got to read Jim Perturba's Ely lecture. In fact, it sort of got to the point where, and not only would they tell me that, but they'd say, and he says this, and then he says that. It got to the point where I was sort of like, yeah, I know, the Perturba paper, I read it. But seriously, it's really a terrific paper. It's one that I think if everybody hasn't read, they need to read. But of course, Jim also has a lot of important research in this area. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jim Perturba. He's going to give a speech, and then he and I'm going to ask him some questions up on the stage. There'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. So Jim Perturba, thank you.
All right, good morning. Martin, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, Brookings and Northwestern Kellogg, for hosting this important event. I think my role this morning is frankly to serve as the warm-up band for the really important and exciting presentations by the true experts on the issues around working longer in the U.S. economy. And I think before I start, I just want to acknowledge that this is a really important problem that is never an acute issue that we have to think about, right? At a moment when we're confronting the shutdown and what do we think about the immediate, next couple of weeks, working longer, the challenges of an aging society, these are questions that proceed very, very slowly and very, very gradually in an economy like the U.S. But that doesn't take anything away from their importance. And in some sense, they are really fundamental challenges that we face. And what I'm going to try to do this morning is sort of to introduce the issues around working longer by trying to provide a little bit of a demographic and economic setting for the landscape in which these questions come up. Because there are a range of different policy issues one can think about. But I think the setting, which is that as an economy looking forward for the next couple of decades, we face a really important challenge in terms of the demographic structure of our population, is something that we just want to recognize at the outset. And then the that's kind of the big picture, and then the tactics we want to use to address that, I think, are important questions to think about. I want to just say, lest I forget later on, that I come wearing 3 different hats, MIT and NBER, which Martin mentioned, but I'm also a trustee at TIA, which is a provider of retirement security products and retirement advice and annuities, and I just want to recognize that because I hope that I can still look at this with, with unconflicted eyes, but I don't want anyone to say, gee, he didn't tell us about that before he started. So, okay, let me start by talking about 2 interrelated issues, what I will call the macroeconomic concerns that lead to thinking about working longer and the microeconomic concerns, and they in some sense are different issues. The macro starts from the fact that we are fortunate to live at a time when life expectancy has been increasing substantially in countries like the United States. Let me see, maybe someone can move this a little bit so that the grid lines don't quite cut through the numbers. But what I've just shown you here is life expectancy at age 65, kind of a traditional retirement age, for men and for women, starting in 1960 and running out to projections that SSA makes for 2060. Okay? And what you find is that in that century, right, life expectancy for men rises by about 8 years, and life expectancy at age 65 for women, which started out higher, rises by something less, about 6 years. Okay? So all else equal, that means that we'll have more older people in the population. And if retirement ages stay where they are, we're going to end up with a larger set of retirees who are not working relative to the size of the workforce, okay, if nothing else changed. And you can see we're about halfway through this transition along the way. And one important thing that I will note now and say more about in a few minutes is this is not an equally distributed improvement in mortality across the income distribution. And that's something that's worth thinking about as we come back. Okay? So what this would map into is something like a larger share of the over 65 population. And you can see that by looking at a measure which is the old age dependency ratio. And this is just the fraction of the population 65 plus over the 25 to 64. And there are various different measures of dependency ratios. The other alternative is to add in children plus the elderly and divide them by the prime age population. There's an old Swedish adage that I heard from George Akerlof that says, 1 woman can take care of 7 children, but 7 children can't take care of 1 mother. That somehow the way societies and families handle child care versus elder care can sometimes be different. So I have focused here on the older part of the dependency ratio, thinking about that because it's particularly relevant for our discussion today. What you see is that in 1960, there was basically 1 member of the 65 plus population for every 5 people who were in the 25 to 64 group. Projecting that forward, it rises by a factor of 2.5 to 2060, right? And we haven't gone too far down that path just yet, right? We're now in the mid-20s in those numbers. And of course, the aging of the baby boomers and the entry of the baby boomers into retirement is going to ramp this number up quickly. This increase is not just due to the increase in life expectancy in old age. Okay? It's also due to the fact that fertility rates have fallen, which means that there's a double whammy. Right? As people reach 65, they're reaching there with more years yet to live, and there are smaller cohorts coming up behind. So we're moving through a transitional period where even if life expectancy hadn't changed, a decline in fertility would have meant a larger old age population relative to the younger population. The 2 forces together mean that we are in a period of really historic transformation of the demographic structure of the US population. And this raises what I will call the macroeconomic question, which is how does one manage to provide for an older population with a smaller group of workers relative to retirees? Okay? And one answer to that question is, well, perhaps you encourage people to work longer. And just to set this in some perspective, right, if instead of doing the ratio 65 plus to 25 to 64, you'd looked in 2060 at the ratio of 70 plus to 25 to 69, right, assuming that people worked for 5 more years, that 48% number would turn out to be around 32%, right? So it would take you to a higher level than we are today, but you would see a much more gradual increase in terms of the increase, in terms of the change. Right? Now, I'm not immediately suggesting that a 5-year increase in work life is on the agenda, but I think it's important to understand for the macroeconomics here where this fits in. Okay, the second issue is the microeconomic aspect of this working longer. Okay, and this focuses in the here and now, and it talks about the adequacy of retirement security and retirement preparation of U.S. households approaching retirement. Okay, and here, heterogeneity is going to be the watchword, and I'll say a little bit more in a minute about the status of the population, but there are certainly concerns that some significant part of the U.S. population, particularly the baby boomers, are not very well prepared for retirement. And this has to do with the shifting nature of retirement security provisions, the shift away from defined benefit plans to defined contribution, and I'll focus for a minute on the low level of returns that people might expect to earn these days relative to in the past, which I think is a very important challenge. Taken together, this means that there may be a group of people, okay, maybe half the population, maybe somewhat less, that is not especially well prepared to sustain their living standard in retirement. Well, what do you do about that? Facing a longer lifespan after retirement, one way to build up more retirement assets is to work longer. And that gives you, in some sense, a double benefit because, as later speakers will explain, by working longer, you shrink the retirement span. Okay? There's a tantalizing possibility out there with some research that suggests that perhaps working longer may actually be a little lifespan enhancing for some people, but I'm going to leave that to the side. But if you just think your lifespan is what it is, working longer is going to shrink your retirement period, and it's also going to ramp up the number of years you have to work, which means you can contribute more and save more in preparation for retirement. So that's the sense in which working longer can be protective of your retirement security at the individual level. So for that group which may not be adequately prepared, the working longer becomes a very important possibility. Now, very important question to think about. Not everybody can work longer. Right? This is a place where, frankly, calling on the academic community to assess the prospects of working longer is, with no offense to the organizers, distinctly the wrong thing to recognize, right? I mean, you have to remember in the employment world I live in, the challenge, everybody wants to work lots longer. The challenge is to get my colleagues to retire when they get into their mid-70s, not to see if we can encourage them to work longer, right? So we may not be the right group to be drawing on to understand this issue, but we do have to recognize that there is heterogeneity in the population in who can and desires to work longer, and that needs to filter into our thinking about the possibilities of using working longer as a retirement security device. But for those who can and want to work longer, the notion that one might work longer as a way of providing for one's retirement seems to be a very powerful device because it has this two-edged aspect that is particularly attractive. I do want to flag one thing in recognizing this, and it's quite different. It's a capital markets issue, not a labor market issue, and it's the declining rate of return that's available to savers today versus what their predecessors had. Basically, when returns are low, saving is not as powerful because of the reduced impact of compounding at low rates of return versus high rates of return. And this is, for anyone who's on an investment, who talks to an investment committee of an endowment or a pension fund, this is a real challenge going forward. I'll just show you one simple chart. This is the real interest rate, the 30-year TIPS yield over the last 20 years, basically. TIPS bonds were yielding about 3.5% at the turn of the millennium. They are today yielding something on the order of 1%. And essentially, being in a world where the interest rate's 1 versus 3 or 3.5 is dramatically different if you're a long-term saver. So one of the things that it implies, and I've done some calculations, I'll just kind of roughly summarize for you. If you asked, and behind this simple chart, there's a lot of machinery, which is the assumption that you're saving every year while you work, you're building up a corpus of assets, and then you're annuitizing it when you get to retirement. But to summarize it all, if you asked, how much would I have to save every year in order to replace 50% of my final earnings, assuming my earnings are pretty much flat over my life cycle, with an annuity stream, if I'm saving for 40 years, right? In a 3% return world, I can do that by saving about 11% of my salary each year. Okay? That is actually within the realm of possibility for many households, I suspect. You reduce the rate of return to 1%, and you have to be saving 23% of your salary. That's pretty high. Okay? You reduce the working life to 30 years instead of 40 years over which you're saving. That number jumps to 30%. And I think that's really getting up there in terms of what you can do. Right? So I just want to flag this because I think that the issues that we are talking about today even if the demography had not changed, even if the birth rate had not changed, even if people had looked like they were well prepared for retirement 15 years ago, the decline in rates of return that the younger generations face in terms of accumulation would make the issue of working longer important. Okay, we need to be thinking about this, but that's not part of the usual dialogue on these topics. All right, so I think that's important to think about. All right, so let me now come back to, if you asked your grandparents, what would you do if you discovered you were going to live longer when you were older? No fancy economic analysis, right? But what would you do? I think you'd get answers very much like what the standard life cycle model tells you to do if you discover you're going to live longer, right? You might say, well, I'm 65. I've just discovered I'm going to live longer. I guess I'll have to consume a bit less while I'm retired. I'll have to ramp down my consumption, right? And that is certainly one reaction to a longer lifespan. Of course, that translates into, in the language of today's discussion, less retirement security, less retirement preparedness, and presumably, lower well-being on the part of the elderly population, okay? If you learned about this earlier, I told you at age 45 you were going to live an extra 5 years when you were retired. You can, of course, increase your saving while working, and that's all got to do with the tilt of your consumption profile and when you're going to do your saving. You could work longer, and of course, that's where we are today in terms of talking about changing the retirement period versus the saving period. You could do something, if we were doing this in the context of a financial markets conference, we'd be talking about reaching for yield. Maybe you'd invest in emerging market securities instead of in treasury bonds and hope that you were going to earn more. And that's certainly something that we observe in some parts of the financial sector where these kind of long-dated liabilities, like a retirement liability, are on the balance sheet, and you're trying to figure out how do you fund them. And then finally, I've put here in very broad terms, collect transfers from working cohorts. And that, of course, could mean if you're an individual, you might think that your children in some way or another might provide for you, right? We go back to before Social Security in the 1930s, right? U.S. household structure looked very different than it does today. The elderly tend to live with their children, right? There were implicit transfers that were taking place within households. One of the first things that happened after Social Security provided more retirement security was the household structure split apart. And whether that was the kids didn't want the parents or the parents didn't want the kids, we don't exactly know. But we know that they decided that they preferred to live independently at that point. And of course, this can be done at the family level, or it can be done at the social level. And at the society level, it's the notion of using intergenerational transfers through something like a social security system that you would think about. And precisely the reason that we're convening this discussion, of course, is because if this is taking place within the fiscal structure and we're using something like intergenerational transfers within Social Security to provide for the retirement security of the elderly, you marry that insight with what I showed you at the beginning about changing demographic structure, and you then realize that it becomes much more financially burdensome on the younger cohorts to provide for the same level of transfers in a society that looks like the U.S. in 2060 than in one that looks like the U.S. in 1960. Right? And therefore asking, are there some levers we can pull, which might involve changing work lives in some cases, becomes a very natural question to think about. All right, so once I've shown you the patterns of this demography and rates of return, a natural question is, well, what have households been doing? Do we see any kind of changes? And this is a chart which shows you, it's taken from some of the work at the Center for Retirement Research, that shows you the age at which the labor force participation rate hits 50% in the U.S. population. The gray line is men. You see that it was a little bit over 65 in 1962. It fell gradually into the low 60s, about 62, by the late 1980s. And it has risen since then. It's now about 63.9. For women, the trend is generally up, although that reflects a combination of factors which have a lot to do with women's labor force participation earlier in the life cycle and not just the women's labor force participation activities in retirement. So there's a little bit of an increase, but certainly nothing like a 5-year increase in the age of retirement, matching some of the numbers we've seen in the demographics. A more striking chart is this one that shows the labor force participation rate of men and women in their late 60s. Right? Now, these are numbers which are below 50%, so that's how they marry with the previous chart. But what you just see is, when I remember first thinking about the economics of retirement, it was in the part where that men's labor force participation rate was dropping sharply, right? It was when we were down to under 25% and that had dropped by almost 20 percentage points in the previous 2 decades. Many forecasts at that point said this was just going to continue, and we were not going to see much labor force activity of older workers in the U.S. economy. And then this changed around, right? And it ramped back up. And I know, just to give you a family version of this story, my dad was fortunate to live to 97 and a half. He retired at 62, and I remember describing to my son that Grandpa has been retired for over 30 years, and he looked back at me incredulously and said, "No way." Well, my dad retired near the bottom of this when it was not at all uncommon for people to be doing that. And of course, my son is thinking about extrapolating this red line out for a few more decades and thinking about what this might look like in the future. So I think this chart is actually very important because it sets up the possibility that there are, in fact, that there is the possibility of adjustment on this margin. The labor supply at older ages is not immutable and can be influenced by a number of factors, and we'll, of course, talk about some of them today. So I think at this point, I want to begin to ask, how do we think about the capacity of older workers to work? And of course, there's an enormous volume of research on this topic. I'll show you a little bit of work which emerged from a major research project that David Wise, my NBER colleague, in this case, Courtney Coyle and Kevin Milligan have done. And they've done the following interesting calculation. Okay? We know that mortality rates at older ages have fallen on an age-specific basis, right? So that the likelihood, the mortality rate for a 63-year-old in 2010, for example, is significantly lower than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, right? So do the following thought experiment. Ask the question, look at the employment rate for a 63-year-old in 2010, okay? And this is looking for men, and that number was about 54%, okay? Ask the question, in 1977, for people who had the same mortality rate as a 2010 63-year-old did, what was the labor market activity rate for those workers? Okay? And this is using the mortality rate as kind of a summary statistic to say, how capable were you of working, or what was your ability to work? It's a summary measure of physical health and willingness to work and whatever. The answer to that question is, this is a period where we're looking back, 33 years, and at the same mortality rate, the employment rate was about 82%, right? So a difference of 18 percentage points in the employment rate. And what you see is that for people, men in their 50s and early 60s, the general pattern was about an 18% gap in the employment activity, conditional on mortality rate. You move to older ages, right? And part of what's happened here is since the mortality rates in the late 60s have declined significantly, you find that gap is even larger, on the order of 40%. And I put this up because I think it motivates the concept that many people have embraced, which is there's at least some capacity for additional work at older ages, and exactly how much, hard to know. Many people could critique this methodology, but it kind of gets you thinking about what's the possibility here in doing this. So in the last couple of minutes, I just want to say, heterogeneity is the critical element when we start to think about this, right? Everything I've done so far talks about life expectancy as a single number, mortality rates as a single number at these different ages. But there is a lot of heterogeneity in the health status, the financial status, and the policy status of older individuals in the U.S. economy. And I think that is a really important consideration to keep in mind in thinking about the capacity of working longer to address retirement security issues. So for example, a thing that we should be focusing on is, are the folks who need more retirement security, right? Think back to my micro motivation, are they the folks who can work longer? Right? Or is there a disconnect between these two groups in a way that's not going to make this a powerful tool for the micro problems I discussed? The macro issues are quite different, right? The macro issues are just, can we generate more output? Can we manage to produce more resources in the economy and consequently reduce the burden on the younger population? And there, even if the population that can work longer is relatively financially well off, right, it may be attractive to provide, increased incentives for labor supply there. But I think that policy design in this area needs to recognize the sort of heterogeneity in a very important way. So let me show you just a couple of things that illustrate this heterogeneity. The first is health status. This is just some data on the number of chronic conditions that people have in advanced age. And what we're looking at is, the first row is 0. So what you find is that at age 65 to 69, about a quarter of the male population has no chronic health condition to speak of, right? These are self-reported, but you get a sense. Another 20% is basically in the one condition category. Only about 15% have 4 or more chronic conditions. So, I'm hardly a doctor to speak about this, but that's kind of getting into a population where you might think there are some issues around trying to work a lot longer. You run that forward into the early 70s, and you see that the group with the 0s and 1s is starting to melt away. The group with multiple conditions is rising. By the time you're at 75 to 79, we've basically flipped, and the group that has 4 or more is now looking the size of the group that had 0 when we were at 65. But just recognizing that there's variation here is important, okay? This is manifest in, link back to my discussion of life expectancy at the beginning, okay? The differences in life expectancy by income status or something like that in the US population in the last few decades are striking. Okay? This is a chart taken from a National Academies report that Peter Orszag, a friend of many people here, co-chaired a couple of years ago. It looks basically at the change, and these are projections, so this is not actual historical data, but it's a projection of mortality improvements. It's life expectancy at age 50 for men. In the 1930 cohort, birth cohort, these are the green folks. So these are folks who basically today would be in their late 80s. Okay, and the 1960 cohort, right? So these are folks who today would be in their late 50s, and it's looking at life expectancy at age 50 for these different groups ranked by lifetime income quintile. Okay, on the far left, you see that there is very little change for the bottom 40% of the population. And there is dramatic change for the top 20% of the population. And top 40% of the population is pretty good. So we're seeing changes on the order of 7 to 8 years of life expectancy at age 50 for the top 40%, and numbers like 1 year at the bottom. Why is that important? Well, it suggests if the mortality rates are indicative of health status in various ways and capacity to work potentially, it suggests that there may be less expansion of that at the lower strata than there is at the top. Okay, now, some very interesting work at the Center for Retirement Research actually looked at this question a couple of years ago and concluded that even for the bottom groups, there was probably some expansion of life expectancy and some improvement in health status. But a lot of this action is basically at the top end. Okay, so that's got to feature somehow in what we're thinking about in designing these policies and asking how this is all going to work. That also matters for thinking about the net lifetime benefits of various social programs, particularly Social Security and Medicare, if you compare the taxes versus the transfers in these programs. But this is a very important feature, I think, to recognize as we think about it. Okay, what about the financial side? Okay, let me show you a couple of slides that just indicate what the heterogeneity in finance looks like for people coming into their older ages. This is data that Steve Venti at Dartmouth and David Wise and I have put together. Looks at the Health and Retirement Study, a very important research tool funded by the National Institute of Aging. These are people who are 65 to 69 households in 2014. Okay? And I want you to look, for example, at the middle column, which is non-retirement financial wealth. And this is always a number that absolutely stuns me, right? This is money outside your IRAs, your 401ks. It's the bank balance, it's your mutual funds, it's whatever else you're holding. The median household in this age group has $12,000 in that category, right? So one very important takeaway is that there are lots of households in the US, even on the eve of retirement or early years of retirement, with very little non-retirement, non-housing financial assets to speak of. Right? So that's telling you something about the potential resilience of these households to financial shocks and whatnot. You then work your way up, and at the 90th percentile, that number is a sort of $330,000, but the bottom is basically 0. Next column over is IRAs and defined contribution pension plans. Right? And what you see there is that, again, at the median, this is very low. Okay, it's $29,000, and the median's just about where these plans start to kick in on a household basis. Top end, $225,000 for the 75th percentile, $705,000 for the 90th percentile. There is a group at the top for whom these defined contribution plans have offered them the opportunity to build significant wealth for retirement. But there's a lot of folks at the bottom, either because they didn't participate when offered, or more likely they were never offered plans, who did not use this system in a way which is built very much in the way of financial assets. Social Security wealth, which is over on the far left here, shows you, of course, the much more even distribution across the society, which is showing you that, and this is a crude attempt to think about the present discounted value of Social Security wealth for these households. The median is about $226,000. Top end is about twice that. But when you put all this together, and notice, by the way, defined benefit plans are that second column over, again, they are tilted toward the top end when you look. Net worth for a median household is around $600,000. Net worth at the 90th percentile is a number like $2.2 million. So the spread here is very large. I want to contrast this with what we saw a minute ago on health status and life expectancy, right? A key issue is, what's the correlation between these two pieces, right? If the folks who have the capacity to work longer are in the bottom couple of rows, then the challenge, of course, is going to be, can we use this as a device to help them? Let me offer you a little bit of evidence on that point. This is data taken from the 2016 Survey of Consumer Finances. It shows you the financial assets of those who are near retirement. This is 60 to 64, 65 to 69, of those who are still working and those who are not. Okay? Now, I'm not going to surprise anybody by telling you that those who are still working are by and large in better financial straits than those who are not, right? So the working 60 to 64-year-old households have financial assets at the median of about $200,000. The ones who are not working at all, 34. Okay? Similarly, up and down the distribution, what you see. So, the challenge here is going to be to figure out how one thinks about putting together the financial status and the work capacity in a way which is helpful going forward. I'll close with one thought, no more slides. If you look across countries, there is substantial heterogeneity in life, in work rates at older ages, right? Age 60 to 64, particularly, even age 65 to 69. There's much less variation in health status and other things, which leads me to conclude that the policy environment matters for work-life length. It matters for labor supply at older ages. And I think it's a great motivation for what we're going to hear over the course of the morning, which is thinking about how different policy tools might be used to alter the incentives, to alter the work environment, and potentially to change what the labor force participation rates look like at these older ages. So thank you very much, and I look forward to talking with Martin about some of these. Yeah.
So we're not quite eyeball to eyeball here. Thanks, Jim. That was very, very helpful.
Martin, can you check to see if the green button's on?
The button is on. Okay, it has to be green, not red. I'm getting to an age where my cognitive ability is sort of declining. Operating microphones is a difficult task. So let me ask you a broad question, first of all. You've described a picture where for some segment of the population, retirement is sort of, they've got plenty of money, they're working longer already, things are pretty good. But for a good segment of the population, certainly the median and below, things look pretty tough. And we also know that defined benefit plans, the traditional pensions, which, it wasn't that everybody had them, but a lot of people, about half the people had them. Those are gradually disappearing, at least in the private sector. So do we have a crisis that we need to make really quite substantial changes in either policy or how people behave? Or is this something where, everything is sort of okay, but we just need to tweak things a little bit? Would you say we have a retirement crisis?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a somewhat unsatisfying answer, which is to say, it's complicated, right? Because I think there are actually three different groups that I would try to distinguish in all of this. There's the group that, under the defined contribution system that we operate with today, that top, maybe it's 25%, has actually accumulated a fair amount of resources, and as they enter the retirement years, will be able to draw down those balances. That group also even in the private sector, has been much more likely to be covered by a defined benefit plan. So they are probably reasonably well prepared for their retirement years. Okay, so that's kind of the top group, and I'm thinking about the kind of calculation that the National Retirement Readiness Index that the Center for Retirement Research prepares, or other attempts to use some replacement rate type measure of what these folks look like. Okay, there's a second group at the lower end, and this is again maybe a quarter of the population, maybe a little bit more, for whom the progressivity of Social Security means that their replacement rate, while not fabulous, is pretty good, right? And there's a broader societal discussion to have about what we want the bottom quarter of our society to look like. But unfortunately, this is a population that has not earned a lot in many cases as they've made their way through the labor market over their career, and for whom the workings of Social Security and other transfer programs will put them in a position that's not dramatically different from where they were when they were working. So, whether that's a retirement issue or that's just a social redistribution issue, I think is hard. Then there's this middle group, and it's actually the middle group where I think the challenges are greatest. And the halcyon days of defined benefit plans in the private sector were not quite as good as the retrospective somehow makes them seem. Right? There were lots of folks who did not have coverage, and the nature of these plans meant that some people reached retirement without coverage. But there was certainly a significant group that did. The move away from defined benefit plans, which were expensive for employers but did give a generous benefit to retirees in many cases, and the replacement of those with 401k type structures where it relies a lot more on individuals doing their own contributing, doing their own investing, right? There's surely a part of that population which has not managed to put enough away to be able to prepare for retirement. And that's the group that I think is going to be challenged. That hopefully is a group that may have the capacity to use some of the working longer device as a way of trying to improve their retirement security. And I think we are in a period where, while I alluded at the beginning to the fact that these demographic changes are, they're kind of glacial, they move through slowly, but we're actually in a period where there's a bit of an inflection coming through. Because as the baby boomers are moving into retirement, even between the older boomers and the younger boomers, there are differences in the extent to which they worked under the defined benefit system in the private sector. So as DB plans were kind of ramping down in the 1980s into the early 90s, or workers who were joining jobs were finding they were not covered by DB plans any longer, that's changed the nature of what the retirement arrangements for these folks will be. So we may be seeing people who are turning 65 in 2025 or 2030 looking quite different in this regard than those who turned 65 in 2015.
So let me ask you about the group that's sort of maybe the bottom third or below the median. So Social Security becomes extremely important, as you said, for that group. Now, one of the contributions that John Chauvin and his colleagues have made at Stanford is assessing the fact that if you work longer and you wait before collecting Social Security, you get a significantly higher Social Security benefit from that. And that really sort of changes quite a bit how much benefit that group will have as they retire. But that's the group that's sort of been waiting tables for 30 years or humping boxes for a package delivery service. And we're sort of saying to them, hey, you've got to work another 5 or 10 years and wait until you can collect Social Security. Moreover, Social Security is not in the greatest shape after all. And you pointed out that the dependency ratio is going to go up a lot. People are talking about the need to cut entitlements, but with rising dependency rate, that's going to be tough. So this adds to my sense that there is a bit of a crisis there, because the people that are dependent on Social Security, it's a struggle for them to get past the point of collecting at 62 and putting it off till 65 or 67 or 70, and the status of the program. So does that need a sort of emergency surgery as well in terms of Social Security?
I think it's great. It's a great question. I think it's important to distinguish two different things as we think about the Social Security claim.
The reason there's an echo is, are you turning your microphone off when he's talking?
I'll turn it off now.
Okay.
This is complexity. I was not.
Right. I think in thinking about the Social Security claiming age issue, it's important to distinguish two things. Right? One is working longer as a way to defer your Social Security claim date, and the other is waiting to claim because you have other assets that enable you to defer that decision. Right? And here, I think there's a nice complementarity between, say, the DC system and the issues around Social Security. So it's important to remember, right, that work is negative leisure. If you go back to your Econ 101, right, there was a labor-leisure choice. You worked, you took leisure. Leisure was a good. Right? And working longer means you're giving up the leisure. So I don't think anybody listening to this discussion today should be lost on you that if we're thinking about people working longer, and that's basically hard, they're giving up the benefits of leisure that they otherwise would have had. Okay? That's a distinct question from if you have money squirreled away in your 401k or your IRA and you're thinking about your work life has stopped at age 65, should you claim Social Security benefits at 65 or should you defer given the way in which your Social Security benefits will be recalculated? And of course, the work that John and his co-authors have done, shows you.
I should say it.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, all our panelists have done very important calculations of how to think about the rate of return that someone earns by deferring their Social Security. I think the key question is, if we're thinking about working longer as opposed to claiming later, right, then what part of the population can work longer? Now, this is where, I think that some of the work that Alicia and her collaborators have done shows that the fraction of jobs which involve the kind of, construction, bricklaying, things like that in the U.S. economy is declining. So while I don't think anyone should ignore the fact there's a group that really probably is, they're either borderline disabled or they're facing real limitations on work by the time they get to age 60, age 62. We need to be thinking about how to protect and help that group as they get to this age. But there may be a substantial group for whom the capacity to work longer is greater. And I think for that group, right, the key is to kind of remove the rocks from the road, to not have there be, artificial disincentives to work or incentives which pull them out of the labor force when they might in fact be quite comfortable working longer and contributing and, of course, addressing my macro challenge, which is what's the societal output that enables you to basically sustain this retirement group. But I think I call it heterogeneity. You may call it our folks beaten down by their work lives. I think it's a really important aspect of thinking about this, and we have to move below the top line, what is the life expectancy, into a more nuanced, what is the fraction of the population that is able to basically continue in the labor force to older ages.
We're sort of running out of time, but I want to give the audience a chance. So there's a question over there. Please state who you are and ask a question and don't make a speech. Thank you.
Hold on a second.
Wait for the mic.
Push the green light.
You're better than me.
Okay. I'm not colorblind, by the way, so in my old age. But Jim, I'm Ted Knutson. I'm a Forbes contributor. The conventional wisdom is that the difference between those who can work longer and those who can't is basically white collar, blue collar. Is conventional wisdom right?
To be honest, I'm not an expert on the labor market data here, but I think to a first approximation, it's the kind of manual job, which is more, there's not a lot of manual white-collar stuff out there. The question is, are there some blue-collar jobs which are not particularly physically demanding and where you could, in fact, continue on, or where there may be opportunities to do something that is perhaps not the initial lifetime job, but gives you a way to continue with some labor market activity. I think one of the things that my labor economics colleagues have demonstrated over the years is that retirement is not as discrete an event as the simple stylized economics model would suggest. It's not you hit age 63 and then you're done. but in many cases it's a second job, it's a part-time job, particularly when you do this at the household level with an average age differential between the husband and the wife of about 3 years of those reaching retirement age today. It may be that one spouse is retired, the other is still working. So there's a number of ways that households can actually continue to have labor income as they look into these advanced ages, which are relative to think about. But I think your rough dichotomy of white blue collar is probably not a terrible way to start down this path. Yeah.
Okay, I think we only have one more question at the back there. Yes.
My name is Elizabeth White, and I'm the author of 55 Underemployed and Faking Normal. And a couple of weeks ago, ProPublica and Urban Institute, there was a study that they did that showed over half of 50-year-olds workers are pushed out of the job market in their 50s, and that those that get a job, again, only 10% get a job that's commensurate with the job that they left. So there's an element I'm hearing of choice to work when I think it actually may not be there.
I think that question in many ways tees up a really important broad issue, which is how do we do lifetime education, skill retraining. As you think about a career which might last 40 or 45 years, the notion that the existing model, which in many cases we operate with, which is acquire some skills at the beginning of your career and then use them for the remaining length of your career, right, doesn't quite feel like it's the way to operate, right? And I'm not the right person to tell you whether the clock speed with which technological change and labor market change is taking place has gone up, but I kind of have a sense it has. That all puts an emphasis, I think, on trying to find ways to facilitate retraining, skill acquisition for workers who are in their 50s or maybe their early 60s. That may be a very important part of thinking about how do you succeed by enabling workers to stay in the labor force longer. And I think we are just at the beginning of asking those questions. The kind of data that you're describing, I think, I've certainly seen statistics along the lines of what you are characterizing. And whether that is the result of sectoral changes, the decline of some parts of the U.S. manufacturing base and things like that, with these workers no longer being employed with jobs they previously had, which might have been a transitional event in the U.S. economy, or whether this is a generic part of what the life cycle experience looks like, which would, of course, suggest we need to work much more attentively to this. I think it's very important to think about as part of this discussion. Yeah.
I'd like you to thank Jim Perturba for Jim Perturba for his fantastic speech.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.